I didn't lock my door because I was scared of strangers. I locked it because of a man who already had a key. That realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like a chill you don't notice until your shoulders start tightening on their own. I was 29 when I moved into that apartment. Second floor. Narrow hallway. Beige carpet that never quite looked clean no matter how many times I vacuumed. The windows faced the parking lot, so at night the orange glow of the streetlights spilled in like a constant reminder that the world didn't sleep just because I wanted to. I liked that place. It was mine. I paid for it alone. I chose the couch, the dishes, the ugly lamp my aunt insisted I take because she said it would grow on me. It never did. But it felt safe. And then there was Julian. Julian was the kind of man who slid into your life without noise. No dramatic entrance, no love bombing, no grand promises. He was quiet in a way that felt intentional. Observant. He watched before he spoke. Listened before he touched. We met through a mutual friend at a cookout. He stood off to the side at first, hands in his pockets, watching people like he was trying to understand the rhythm before stepping in. When we finally talked, it was easy. No tension. No performance. He asked me real questions. About my job. About my mother. About why I lived alone when I clearly didn't have to. I told him I liked my space. He smiled and said he respected that. That should have been the first thing I remembered later. Julian didn't rush me. That was his power. He didn't pressure me into staying over. He didn't push for labels. He didn't flood my phone with messages that demanded immediate responses. He let things breathe. And I mistook that for maturity. When he eventually started staying over, it felt natural. Like a routine forming instead of an invasion. He brought his toothbrush, but he asked first. He kept a pair of shoes by my door, but they were always lined up neatly, never sprawled like he was marking territory. When he asked for a spare key, it didn't feel like a red flag. It felt practical. I worked long hours at a legal aid office, helping women navigate housing disputes and messy breakups. Irony didn't escape me later, but at the time, I thought I was too smart to end up in my own cautionary tale. I gave him the key on a Tuesday evening. He turned it over in his fingers, smiling softly, like I'd given him something fragile. I didn't know then that some men treat access like currency. At first, everything stayed the same. Julian still texted before coming over. Still knocked, even though he didn't need to. Still asked if I was okay with him being there. Then small things shifted. I would come home and notice the air felt different. Not bad. Just stirred. Like someone had moved through my space and left traces behind. The couch pillows would be arranged differently. The bathroom light left on. The faint smell of his soap lingering when he wasn't. I told myself it was normal. He had a key. Then one night, I came home later than expected. The hallway lights were dimmer than usual, flickering slightly like they always did when the building was half asleep. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and froze. The shower was running. Steam curled out from under the bathroom door. My heart jumped hard enough to make my chest ache. Julian's shoes were by the door. Neatly lined up. He stepped out of the bathroom a few seconds later, towel slung low around his hips, water dripping from his hair onto my floor like he belonged there. He smiled when he saw me. He said he thought I'd be home later. I laughed it off. Joked about him surprising me. But something inside me tightened. He hadn't texted. He hadn't called. He hadn't asked. He had just let himself in. That night, when we lay in bed, his body warm and heavy against mine, his hand tracing slow circles on my lower back, I tried to relax into it. His touch was good. Familiar. Confident. The kind of touch that made my breathing deepen without effort. But my mind stayed awake. Because intimacy feels different when you didn't choose the moment it started. A few days later, I noticed my desk drawer slightly open. I knew I'd closed it. Inside that drawer were things I didn't like people touching. Old letters. A folded lease agreement. A small envelope with emergency cash. Private things. I asked Julian about it casually. He said he'd been looking for a pen. He said mine always worked better than his. He smiled when he said it. I smiled back. That was the night I started locking my bedroom door when he stayed over. Not obviously. Just quietly. Like a habit. Julian didn't comment on it. But the next morning, he asked if I was stressed. He said I'd been distant. He said he wanted to help. The concern in his voice sounded genuine. That's the hardest part. Men who mean harm don't always look harmful. Sometimes they look attentive. Calm. Patient. Sometimes they look like solutions. Weeks passed. Julian started staying over more often. Sometimes when I wasn't there yet. Sometimes when I was still at work. He said it made sense with traffic. He said he didn't like waiting in his car. I started noticing things missing. Not valuables. Small things. A scarf I hadn't worn in a while. A notebook moved from my nightstand to the shelf. A photo turned face down on my dresser. When I asked, Julian shrugged it off. He said maybe I misplaced them. I wanted to believe him. But my body didn't. One night, after he fell asleep, I got up quietly and walked through my apartment. I stood in the doorway of each room, looking at my life like it belonged to someone else. That was when I noticed it. The lock on my bedroom door. Scratched. Like someone had tested it. Not broken. Just tested. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the doorknob, my heart pounding in my ears. Julian slept peacefully behind me. I didn't wake him. I didn't confront him. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until morning. The next day, I changed my locks. I didn't tell him. Not yet. Because I wasn't sure what I was protecting myself from. But I knew this much. Something about the way Julian wanted access felt less like love. And more like entitlement. Julian didn't notice the locks right away. Or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. Both possibilities unsettled me in different ways. The first night after I changed them, he texted to say he'd be coming by after work. He didn't ask. He stated it, casually, the way you talk about something you assume is already agreed upon. I responded with a neutral okay and put my phone face down on the counter. When he arrived, he knocked. That should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like a test. I opened the door, and his eyes flicked, just for a second, to the lock. Not enough for someone who wasn't looking, but enough for someone who was checking. He didn't comment. He leaned in, kissed my cheek, and said my place smelled good. I let him in. The evening unfolded the way it usually did. We ate takeout. We talked about our days. He told me about a coworker who was getting on his nerves. I told him about a client who reminded me too much of myself to stay detached. He listened. Asked questions. Nodded in the right places. But there was a tightness in him I hadn't felt before. Not anger. Attention. Like he was studying me instead of relaxing into me. Later, when we were on the couch, his hand slid along my thigh slowly, deliberately. His thumb traced a familiar path, the one he knew would make my breathing change. Normally, I would have leaned into it without thinking. This time, I stayed still. Not stiff. Just present. His hand paused. He looked at me and asked if I was okay. I said I was tired. He smiled and said he could help with that. He kissed me then, slow, warm, practiced. His mouth moved against mine with patience, not urgency. He tasted familiar. Safe. My body responded automatically, heat pooling low in my stomach despite the tension humming beneath my skin. That confused me. I hated that it confused me. Because attraction doesn't vanish just because trust starts cracking. His hand moved again, this time firmer, sliding to my hip. He pulled me closer, his body heat pressing in, his breath deepening. He whispered my name like it belonged to him. Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. Not fear. Possession. I pulled back slightly. Just enough to create space. Julian's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something more controlled. He didn't grab me. He didn't push. He waited. He asked what was wrong. I told him nothing was wrong. I told him I just needed to slow down. He nodded, but his jaw tightened. He said he understood. But the rest of the night, he touched me differently. Not less. More carefully. Like he was recalibrating. When we went to bed, he wrapped himself around me from behind, his arm heavy across my waist. His hand rested on my stomach, fingers splayed, thumb moving in small, absent-minded strokes. It felt intimate. Too intimate. Like a reminder. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, acutely aware of where every part of him was. His breathing. His warmth. The way his leg hooked around mine like an anchor. At some point, his hand slid lower, resting just above my hip bone. He didn't push further. He didn't need to. It was the placement that unsettled me. Like he was claiming territory he feared he might be losing. The next morning, he woke before me. I heard him moving around the apartment, opening drawers, running water, the quiet clink of a mug being set on the counter. He knew my routine well enough to navigate without asking. When I came into the kitchen, he was making coffee. My coffee. He smiled when he saw me and said he thought he'd be helpful. I thanked him. I watched him as I leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely. He moved comfortably, confidently, like this space belonged to him. I realized then that giving someone access doesn't always look like handing over keys. Sometimes it looks like letting them learn your rhythms. Before he left, he kissed me goodbye and said he might stop by later. He didn't ask. I said I'd let him know. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with all the lights on. Not because I was scared of the dark. Because I wanted to see everything clearly. I opened drawers. Checked shelves. Looked through my closet. Nothing was missing. But things felt, handled. Like my space had been edited. I sat on my bed and tried to name the feeling in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was vigilance. The kind that wakes up when your body realizes something your mind hasn't fully accepted yet. Julian texted around 11 p.m. asking if he could come over. I said not tonight. He responded quickly, asking if everything was okay. I said yes. There was a long pause. Then he said okay, sweet dreams. No pressure. No argument. But my phone buzzed again 10 minutes later. He said he missed me. I didn't respond. I turned my phone face down and listened to the quiet of my apartment. The hum of the fridge. The distant sound of traffic. My own breathing. For the first time since I'd met Julian, I felt like I was alone in my space. Truly alone. And instead of relief, I felt a strange ache. Because some part of me still wanted him. Still wanted the warmth. The familiarity. The way he made me feel seen when things were good. That's what scared me most. Not that he wanted access. But that part of me still wanted to give it. The next few days felt like a quiet standoff. Not hostile. Not dramatic. Just measured. Julian didn't push. He didn't show up unannounced. He didn't accuse me of anything. On the surface, he respected my space in a way that would have impressed anyone who didn't know what to listen for. But the questions started. They came wrapped in concern, delivered softly, like he was checking on my well-being. The kind of questions that sound caring until you realize how specific they are. He asked what time I'd been getting home lately. He asked if my workload had changed. He asked if I was feeling overwhelmed, if I needed more support. Support was his favorite word. He said it like something he provided. Like a service. Like a thing I might lose if I didn't accept it correctly. One evening, we met for dinner at a quiet spot near my apartment. A small place with dim lights and tables close enough that you could hear other people's conversations if you weren't careful. He chose the booth facing the door. I noticed that immediately. He liked to see who came in. Julian reached across the table and took my hand. His thumb brushed the inside of my wrist, slow and familiar, tracing the pulse there like he was checking something. He said I seemed different lately. I asked how. He said I felt farther away. I told him I'd been tired. He nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. He asked if I was stressed at work. I said sometimes. He asked if anything had changed in my life recently. I held his gaze and said no. That was the moment I understood the real shift. He wasn't asking to understand me. He was asking to locate himself. After dinner, he walked me home. The night air was cool, the streetlights buzzing faintly. We stood outside my building for a moment, the way couples do when they're deciding whether the night is over. He leaned in to kiss me. I let him. His mouth was warm, controlled, patient. He kissed me like he always did, unrushed, intentional. His hand rested at my waist, fingers spread, grounding. For a second, my body relaxed into muscle memory. Then his hand slid slightly lower, just enough to test. I pulled back. He didn't follow. He smiled gently and said I was allowed to say no. That should have reassured me. Instead, it felt like a note being taken. Inside my apartment, I turned on the lights and kicked off my shoes. Julian followed me in, glancing around like he always did, quick, practiced. He asked if I'd rearranged things. I said maybe. He walked into my bedroom without asking and sat on the edge of the bed like he belonged there. I stayed by the door. He patted the mattress beside him and asked me to come sit. I didn't. That was new. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, not annoyed but curious. He asked if I trusted him. The question landed heavy. I asked him what made him ask that. He shrugged and said he just wanted to make sure we were okay. I told him trust wasn't something you check like a pulse. It's something you notice when it's gone. His jaw tightened. Just slightly. He stood up and crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet away from me. He didn't touch me. He didn't crowd me. He just stood there, close enough that I could feel his presence without contact. He said he missed when things were easy between us. I said easy for who? He smiled like it was a joke, but it didn't reach his eyes. That night, when he left, I locked the door behind him and leaned against it, my heart racing. Not because I thought he'd hurt me. Because I realized how much effort it was taking to hold my ground. Over the next week, Julian became more attentive in a way that felt strategic. He brought groceries I hadn't asked for. He offered to fix things that weren't broken. He texted more often, checking in, asking where I was, how long I'd be out. Nothing aggressive. Nothing obvious. Just persistent. One afternoon, I came home to find a small bag hanging from my doorknob. Inside was a candle. A book he knew I liked. A note telling me he was proud of how hard I worked. My stomach turned. Gifts aren't always gifts. Sometimes they're reminders. That night, I called my best friend and told her everything. Not the dramatic parts, there weren't any yet. Just the feeling. The pressure. The way Julian seemed to orbit my life more tightly the more space I tried to claim. She listened quietly. Then she asked a question that made my chest ache. She asked if I felt free with him. I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was uncomfortable. I felt desired. I felt chosen. I felt important. But I didn't feel free. And that realization shifted something in me. The next time Julian came over, I didn't invite him in right away. We stood in the hallway, the door open behind me, the lock visible. He looked at it. This time, he didn't pretend not to notice. He asked why I'd changed the locks. I told him calmly that I needed my space to feel like mine again. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he nodded and said he understood. But his eyes told a different story. They told me he was recalculating. They told me the balance had changed. And whatever Julian had been enjoying, access, comfort, proximity, it no longer felt guaranteed. That's when men like him become the most careful. And the most revealing. I didn't end things with Julian in a dramatic moment. No shouting. No tears in public. No last kiss that lingered too long. It ended the way things like this usually do when a woman finally listens to herself. Slowly. Calmly. Without asking permission. After the night he asked about the locks, something shifted between us. He stayed polite. Attentive. Even softer in some ways. But the question stopped pretending to be casual. He asked when I'd be home. He asked if anyone had been over. He asked if I was pulling away on purpose. Each question came with a smile, with a tone that suggested concern, but the weight of them stacked up in my chest like furniture I hadn't agreed to move. I started noticing how often I measured my words around him. How I edited my tone. How I softened my boundaries so they wouldn't sound like rejection. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about love anymore. It was about access. One evening, I told him I needed a few days to myself. I said it clearly, without apology. I told him I wasn't mad, just tired and needing space. He said he understood. Then he asked how many days. I told him I wasn't sure. That answer bothered him more than anything else I could have said. The next morning, I woke up to 3 messages from him. Not angry. Not demanding. Just checking in. Making sure I was okay. Letting me know he was thinking about me. I didn't respond. I went to work. I focused on my clients. I listened to other women talk about boundaries they wished they had set sooner. I noticed how easily I encouraged them to protect themselves. That irony didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. That night, I cooked dinner for myself and ate in silence. No TV. No phone. Just the sound of my fork against the plate and my own breathing. I realized something simple and devastating. I felt lighter when he wasn't there. Not lonely. Lighter. Julian came over 2 days later, unannounced but polite, knocking instead of using the key he no longer had. I opened the door but didn't step aside. We stood in the hallway like strangers. He asked if we could talk. I said yes, but not inside. We went for a walk instead. The neighborhood was quiet, the air cool, streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. He walked close to me but didn't touch. He asked if I was pulling away. I told him I was pulling back. He asked why. I told him because I no longer felt comfortable. That word landed hard. Comfortable. He said he never meant to make me feel that way. He said he cared about me. He said he thought we were building something. I told him we were, but it wasn't something I wanted anymore. He stopped walking. I kept going a few steps, then turned back to face him. I told him I needed a relationship where my boundaries didn't feel like threats. Where space didn't have to be negotiated. Where access wasn't assumed. He listened quietly. Too quietly. Then he asked if there was someone else. I shook my head. I told him this wasn't about replacing him. It was about reclaiming myself. He nodded slowly, like he was accepting information he didn't like but couldn't argue with. He said he respected my decision. I believed him. Because control doesn't always end with anger. Sometimes it ends with retreat. We said goodbye without hugging. Without promises to stay friends. Without leaving the door cracked open. When I walked back to my apartment alone, I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the knob. Nothing felt tight in my chest. Nothing felt rushed. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. My space stayed untouched. My routine stayed mine. My phone stayed quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty. I noticed how much energy I had been spending anticipating someone else's reactions. How much of myself I had been shaping around what felt easiest for him. That awareness didn't make me angry. It made me careful. I didn't miss Julian the way I thought I would. I missed the version of myself who believed calm always meant safe. Now I knew better. Calm can be calculated. Patience can be strategic. Attention can be a way in. Love, real love, never makes you feel like your space is shrinking. Months later, I ran into Julian once at the grocery store. He smiled politely. Asked how I was. Told me he hoped I was doing well. I was. And I didn't feel the need to explain that. That was the real ending. Not a twist. Not a revelation. Just a woman noticing when something no longer felt right, and choosing herself quietly, completely, and without regret.